Welcome back. And as we begin a new session, we finally begin the last major phase of the course, which is the Roman history and literature part of this course. This is chapters 18 through 20 of your Harris-Platzner textbook. So at this point, we have completed our videos and our forum assignments for all of the Greek authors, and now we're going to be wrapping up the course with the two Roman authors, Virgil and Ovid, as well as getting some overview on the Roman world and how it took in Greek mythology from earlier and reformatted it for its own needs. So I'm really glad that you made it this far in the course. Congratulations for doing so. And at this point in the course, if you're following the summer schedule, you now are on the third day of the fourth week of the course. It also stretches into the fourth day of the fourth week, and then into the first day of the final week. Is the Roman section. If you are doing the school year session, then this is going to be the next session in the weekly calendar after the completion of Euripides, the Medea, and the Medea point of view. Okay, so I'd like you to pause your video at this point and do a couple of things. First of all, I'd like you to go to your calendar and locate the sessions that pertain to the Roman world, chapters 18 through 20 of the Harris-Platzner textbook. Please go to the first one. There are a series of lengthy outlines that will provide you some additional background on the Roman world, and I would suggest you keep them open as you follow along these next few videos so that you can keep the information straight. That's the first thing I'd like you to do. And the second thing is I'd like you to open the document that's called Mythical History of Rome. And have that as well in front of you because it also pertains to the way that history is set up in the ancient Roman world. So please pause your video and open that document, Mythical History of Rome, which you can find under resources, and also open up the calendar to the correct session for chapter 18 in Harris-Platzner. Okay, have you done those two things? Excellent. So I'm going to give you a quick overview here of Roman history as is described for us in our sources. One of the main historical sources we do have that's listed on your Mythical History of Rome document is Livy. His history was written during the first years of the Roman Empire under Emperor Augustus, and he happened to get along quite well with Augustus, and Augustus, in fact, did quite a bit to sponsor his writing of history. And so much of what he writes is intended to be a back view of ancient history in order to inform the occupants of the new Roman Empire what their history was like in order to understand what was great about the growth of Rome, but also some errors and moralistic sins that the Romans may have committed in the past or observed committed around them in the past that should inform them of how to be more morally upright in their current day. Livy's main concern was that the Romans were failing to do that. He spends a very long prologue explaining that, and so he wanted to provide information to inform the Romans that they really needed to be careful as they went forward with this new form of government. Obviously, most historians tended to write in the mode of saying, the ancient world before me was much better, and I can't stand living in the modern world. Remember that that's the way Hesiod describes the ages and works and days. But it probably was genuinely true that Livy really was concerned because the Roman Empire had been a very costly undertaking in terms of political well-being, as well as, of course, the loss of life and property involved. And so the hope was that all of this would eventually be worthwhile. The Romans were really going to be successful imperial powers, but of course, none of that could be taken for granted. And so that history comes together as a cautionary note for how, in fact, to conduct oneself under the empire. Okay, so with that little bit of preface, let's now turn to these ages. And I'm actually going to divide these up into different videos in order to make it easier for you to view these. So first of all, let me actually go prior to the king period and talk about the prehistory of Rome. So Rome itself, from what we understand from the archaeological remains in the modern city, was probably founded in some form long before this artificial date of 753 BC, and it was probably a series of small villages that eventually came together into the larger city of Rome. Its situation on the Tiber River was ideal because although it was not right on the mouth of the Tiber itself, that was the port of Ostia that was constructed later by Emperor Claudius, nonetheless, the Tiber was a really ideal spot for trade, for the successful import and export of goods. And so this was became eventually a natural meeting place for many different peoples, not only in Italy itself initially, but also gradually from outside. So Rome had a lot of the same advantages that the city in Egypt, Alexandria, had. Alexandria also was essentially a melting pot of civilizations because it too was placed near the mouth of a river and was in a location where many different peoples would have to cross and might potentially stop there. So Rome had that same advantage, and in time would grow up to be a very important city, and then eventually the most important city for a period. From what we can tell, therefore, though, Rome certainly, as the old saying says, was not actually built in a day. That in fact it grew up into the city that we think of as Rome over quite a long period of time, and definitely over a much longer and more gradual period than this date of 753 BC would suggest. A lot of the actual history of what was going on in the early days of Rome is unfortunately clouded with mythology. And when you read Livy's history, where we get a lot of the information about the kings, you could tell easily that it's really difficult to separate the myth from the fact. And I suspect that for the Romans, that was not really ever an issue, because probably one of the most important motives for the Romans to compose history was to justify why they had been successful in becoming an empire and why it was morally okay for them to maintain that empire once they'd gotten it. So for that reason, there's quite a bit in their mythology that probably is maybe placed there in order to get the story to come out right, in order for the Romans to be successful at defining their own identity. There's a term that we use in a different course, 396 Myths of Rome, Romanitas, which is basically the definition of Roman identity. And again, part of that is the psychological need to justify their empire, as well as the political, more pragmatic need to make their empire seem again, that it was worth whatever costs had to be paid to get it there. So okay, so it's hard to know precisely what was going on with the real Rome in these very early days. It probably did have a monarchy. However, it is unlikely that the 7 kings that we have listed in Livy were the exact 7 kings who ruled for those exact same years. The idea that the 7 straight monarchies could have gone, especially the last one, could have gone forward with hardly any interruption does not make very much sense. And there, in fact, are pieces of evidence outside of Livy to suggest that there were actually more kings, and that potentially the period of kingship might have either been earlier or later than these dates would suggest. So again, we have to really take with a grain of salt this whole conception of the so-called 7 kings of Rome. Of course, the first pair were Romulus and Remus II, who are clearly mythical, and so that casts further doubt on whether we can really trust the historicity of this setup of kings. Nonetheless, though, we'll take it as acceptable that the Romans did have kings in the early days, and what is evident is that the Romans recognized in their history that they were originally ruled by kings, and they did not want to go back to that, because especially after the final of the 7 kings, Tarquinius Superbus, the Romans basically treated the word rex in their language, meaning king, as a bad word. If you've read Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, you remember the famous incident with Mark Antony offering a diadem to Caesar to become king during a public games event, and Caesar refusing this offer of honor, but refusing it more reluctantly. Associated with Caesar is the phrase, "My name is Caesar, not Rex." So although Caesar may have been tempted to become king, he was aware, maybe in spite of himself, that actually becoming king and restoring the monarchy would have been absolutely politically disastrous, very likely suicidal. Of course, what he did in reality turned out to be just as suicidal, and that was becoming perpetual dictator. But you could see the difficulty. different strokes for different folks, so to speak. It really doesn't matter necessarily what form of absolute rule one has. If it's one person with unchecked power in a complete control, whether it's a king or a dictator, that absolute rule won't stay in place for too long. Eventually, there will be an uprising that will topple it. Okay, so now let's talk about the seven kings themselves. You have, of course, the mythical Romulus. After the unfortunate murder of his brother Remus, Romulus becomes the first king of Rome. Now, the story of Romulus and Remus, of course, is preceded by the story of Aeneas that's described to us in our next chapter, chapter 19, in Virgil's Aeneid. Aeneas is the refugee from Troy, after Troy is defeated by the Greeks, who sails across the Mediterranean, driven by his fate, his destiny, to eventually found a colony on the west coast of Italy, near the Tiber River. It's called Lavinium, and that colony is the one that will eventually spawn the growth of the city of Rome, which again is dated to 753 BC. So Romulus and Remus are descendants from Aeneas through the god Mars. They're twins, and they get tossed into a basket on the Tiber River because their great uncle has tossed out of power their grandfather. The great uncle is Amulius, and their grandfather is Numitor. So, of course, the boys don't know this. Now, Amulius tried to get Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin, so that she would be celibate and never give any children who might potentially become avengers. But as sort of happens with Oedipus, these two twins, Romulus and Remus, come about because Mars manages to make his way to Rhea Silvia, and two twins are born. And when these two twins are discovered by the king, they get tossed into the sea in a basket. And once again, like Oedipus, they survive. And when they wash ashore, apparently the tide was too low to flood them. And a she-wolf famously locates them and nurses them, and a woodpecker from Jove also comes down and feeds them as well, until eventually the shepherd Faustulus locates them and raises them. Now, when Romulus and Remus grow up, they learn about what has happened to their grandfather Numitor, and they depose Amulius and put Numitor back in power. And then they're going to found a city themselves in celebration of that. The problem comes up, though, when they found the city, who is going to be in charge of it? So we had a problem with brothers before, with unfortunately Eteocles and Polynices, and now once again we have Romulus and Remus. The two of them cannot agree on exactly who is going to be the first king. So they decide to settle it by each one going off to a different hill to find vultures. So Romulus goes to one hill, Remus goes to another hill, two of the famous 7 hills of Rome. When they come back, one says, I saw 6 vultures, and the other one says, I saw 12 vultures, and so one says, well, I saw mine first, and the other one says, but I saw more of them. Vultures are considered by the augurs to have been signs of good omen and, in this case, of rule. So which one is it? They can't agree, and they start arguing. And finally, Remus jumps over the border that's been put around the prospective city where it's going to be built. He jumps over it as an insult, and then Romulus slaughters him. This episode of fratricide is commemorated by the poet Horace, who is contemporary with our poet Virgil, in an epode, number 16, in which he describes bitterly, and also another one, number 11, in which he describes bitterly the idea that Roman history is to be seen as founded on the blood of two quarreling brothers. Nonetheless, though, that is the way that the myth comes forward, and so Romulus therefore becomes the first king. Okay, so in our next video, we're going to continue forward with the story of the kings, more about Romulus himself, and then the other kings that come forward. Okay, so come right back for the next video.